So, you want to split a god? Well, I may be able to help. Now, some of you may be less interested in splitting a god. You may be wondering why one would even want to do such a thing, or even what do I mean by splitting a god. Well, let me give a little bit of background. Imagine you're a good king, say of the Hittites, and you want to honor a deity, let's say Ishtar, who has an established temple in a place like Kizuwatna. How, in practical terms, do you coax a deity into taking up residence in a new temple you have built for them so that you can reap all of the benefits of having their divine presence in your land? This is the context of a tablet found at Hattusha called KUB 29.4 or CTH 481A. Thankfully, scholars have given it a slightly more charming title, Expansion or Adlocation of the Cult of the Goddess of the Night. The older title, The Resettlement of the Black Goddess, has a bit more gravitas, but it is a bit less precise. And this tablet was found in excavation and is probably best dated to sometime in the 14th century. Other very similar Hittite texts refer to an episode when my ancestor Tudhaliya, the great king, separated the goddess of the night from Kizuwatna city and made her separately in Samuha. Some of the geography isn't entirely clear here, but it's likely this is talking about separating a goddess from her cult site in Kumani, the chief city of Kizuwatna, and moving her to Samuha, which is likely near modern Sivas. Another similar text records, then during the reign of my brother, that is Muwatalli II, I, that is Prince Hattusili, separated Shaushka and made her new temples in Urakina. These episodes all seemingly made use of the ritual found in KUB 29.4 to aid them in establishing a new cult center. That is to say, the fullest text of the ritual we have seems to have commonality with these historically attested episodes of separating a goddess, even if this particular tablet is not specifically associated with any one event. The earliest incident of this being used is likely that of Tudhaliya splitting the goddess, which must have happened in the late 15th century. Kizuwatna was a kingdom in the region known in classical sources as Cilicia. The region was a cultural and political frontier and zone of interaction between the Hurrian-dominated kingdom of Mitanni, based in the Copper Triangle, and the Hittites in the central Anatolian plateau. Kizuwatna, in the late 15th century, had been subject to Idrimi, king of Alalak, and subject to the king of Mitanni. And so Kizuwatna had, over the course of the 15th century, been increasing in Hurrian cultural and religious influence. Under Tudhaliya, the Hittites signed a treaty with Kizuwatna. The treaty is interesting for a number of reasons, including that Kizuwatna and the Hittites are on almost equal terms, even though it seems clear the Hittites are the dominant power. But following this treaty, scholars note Hurrian and more generally Syrian influence increased in Hittite culture and religion. In Tudhaliya's case, he built a temple in his own kingdom so as to honor the goddess of his new political ally. The KUB 29.4 text likely dates to after this, likely to the late Middle Kingdom or early New Kingdom Hittite period, but a similar ritual was likely at work. It's also noteworthy the deity in question who is split is called the Goddess of the Night. Early translators translated the term night as black, thus the older title of Resettlement of the Black Goddess. But scholars are now more confident Goddess of the Night is the title of the goddess in question. And while we may know her title, we don't actually know too much about this goddess. Citing the chronologically later text alluded to earlier wherein Hattusili separated Shaushka, some scholars link the Goddess of the Night with Shaushka, which is the Hurrian goddess who was often equated with Ishtar in Mesopotamia. The KUB 29.4 text also makes frequent mention of Pirinkir. The Goddess of the Night and Pirinkir are treated almost like a dyad in the text. Pirinkir is a name you'll also see spelled a variety of different ways. She seems to have originated in Elam, but gained prominence in the Hurrian pantheon. In some Babylonian texts, Ishtar and Pirinkir are used interchangeably, suggesting the Goddess of the Night may be the Kizuwatnan iteration of Ishtar. But the Goddess of the Night has some idiosyncrasies which we don't see with any versions of Ishtar. For one, the Goddess of the Night title is not known from Syrian or Mesopotamian sources. It's not a name or title that we ever see used. The stars are often called gods of the night, but a specific goddess of the night is just not known. Also, the ritual seems to indicate the goddess of the night had an underworld association, which is not something we see with Ishtar. But most scholars still think the goddess of the night is some local Kizzuwatnan version of Ishtar. And this is in part because Ishtar was associated with the planet Venus, understood as a bright star, and so she was known to manifest herself at night. There are also Middle Hittite oracular texts that have several inquiries specifically to Ishtar, and among these inquiries are interspersed other inquiries of the goddess of the night. And we also know Ishtar had a hermaphroditic quality. She could be male or female, depending on if they were linked with the morning or evening star. And in the expansion of the goddess of the night, as part of the ritual, the goddess in question is furnished with 2 sets of clothes, one female and one male. So the equation with Ishtar is usually accepted by most scholars, which means our text is about how to split Ishtar into 2. I promise I'll get to the splitting in a second, but it's important to get to the bottom of the actual issue at hand. The reason the Hittites would seek to split a goddess in the first place, and that requires stepping into the religious worldview of the ancient world. First, the existence of many gods was presumed a fact. And not only a fact, but the gods were, by definition, powerful and able to impact the course of human lives. And while these gods were presumed to occupy their natural environment, some in the sea, some in the sky, some in the underworld, and so on, many were also expected to inhabit a constructed home, that is, a temple. And these temples served as access points for divine and human interaction. They united heaven and earth in a single space. And while we may think of modern temples and churches as places of community worship, that's not how temples operated in the ancient world. They were the house of the gods. As such, the temples were meant to accommodate primarily divine needs, and having a powerful deity inhabit a temple may offer all kinds of blessings with tangible real-world benefits, and so having a temple inhabited by a god or goddess was generally a good thing. But how can one be sure that the deity actually inhabits the temple if you build it? If you build it, will they come? And different cultures had different responses to this issue. The framework most of us may be most familiar with, at least implicitly, is that of the Israelites, which came to teach God was omnipresent. An all-powerful God can be in all places at the same time, so this may not seem like a huge issue for many modern observers. However, this is not how most Near Eastern conceptions of the gods worked. They had a much more anthropomorphic conception of the gods. So other cultures developed rituals to ensure their temples would host the divine presence. In Mesopotamia, they practiced what has come to be known as the mythic ritual, or the washing of the mouth ritual. This was a protracted ritual which took a human-made cult image, which was then ritually washed, notably the mouth, in order to remove human contamination. And then other washings took place, and the cult statue was moved from various locales, and this was all done to make sure the statue was a suitable locus for divine animation. The god was not equated with the statue, but their presence was concretized in the statue as a consistent, readily available access point between the god and humanity. And so the cult statue had to be purified, in a sense enlivened, so the divine presence could be localized to it before it, and the deity which animated it, took up residence in the temple. And cult statues varied in form from region to region and over time. They could be small, and some sources indicate they could be near life size. Some were intricately carved or shaped to look like the deity, and others could be formless. Their appearance mattered less than their function as nexus points for the divine entity to occupy, where they could be interacted with by humans. But given the more anthropomorphic view of the gods prevalent in the ancient world, there's an interesting theological issue in how is one god in more than one place at a time. And this is where our text in the splitting of the goddess comes in. The text, KUB 29.4, describes the process by which one could get the goddess of the night to take up residence in a new temple. We won't go through all the intricate details, but there are a few notable highlights. The text begins by telling us who wrote the text. Scribes and priests from Babylon and most likely Kizzuwatna. But it tells us this is what we need if we want to build another temple of the goddess of the night and settle the deities separately. The term settle here is shara, and how to interpret this word is pretty vital to understanding this text. Richard Beale has argued it can't mean to cross or to transfer as the syntax would suggest, but instead to divide is the better translation. And we have other texts about transferring cult statues from place to place, and it doesn't match this. So we're not talking about moving a cult statue from one temple to another, but are talking about dividing a deity. And the ritual unfolds over a period of 5 days. Day 1 deals with fashioning the cult image, the statue. It deals with the furniture for the temple and 2 pairs of garments, male and female. The idea is to make the new statue similar to the old one. Day 2 begins in the morning before the sun has arisen. Conceptually, this is likely done because this is when the goddess is out and active, at night. Waters for purification are drawn from the house of the builder of the new temple and placed on the roof of the old temple, and colored cloth is tied to the old statue. This is done to attract or pull the deity into the old temple. The deity is thus attracted to the cult image and bound to it with something called ulichi, which is some sort of wool yarn. Day 3 all begins in the morning when the stars are still in the sky. The water is taken from the roof down into the temple, and it seems the goddess in her morning star aspect, as reflected in the water, was drawn down into the water and then brought into the temple proper. The officiant prostrates before the cult image, and then a pit is dug. It seems that now the sun is up, and the goddess of the night is not in the night sky, but she's now in the underworld. The priest pulls her up from the pit 7 times. And during the day, several blood sacrifices are made, and at dusk, the water is returned to the roof along with the supplies that will be needed for day 4. And day 4 involves looking after Pirinkir, who gets well-being offerings, and they scatter bread and fruit for her. Day 5 ends the ritual at the old temple. On the morning of the 5th day, they offer bread, oil, and beer. Then the practitioner speaks, "You, honored goddess, preserve your being but divide your divinity. Come to these new temples, take an honored place, and when you make your way, then take yourself only that place." In the new temple, red strings, a sort of symbolic red carpet for the recently divided deity, are pulled from the walls to the new cult image, and various offerings are given and the cult implements are set in place. And then the new temple is purified and considered functioning. Now, if you were to try this, your experience may vary. I can't guarantee results. And as a general rule, I discourage anyone from occult participation. But this ritual, in the form we have it, is likely incomplete. In fact, scholars believe this ritual is really more of a shorthand. What we have is not enough to establish an entirely new functioning cult. So most scholars think it served more like a memory tool meant to give the basic outlines of a more complete and fleshed out ritual that the practitioners would have known. Several actions, some potentially vital for success, are not recorded. It is generally assumed the rituals needed to vivify the cult statue, like the Mesopotamian ritual, are not recorded but likely would have been performed. But if it was done properly, we can see that to split a god in the Hittite world was not to weaken her, but to extend her jurisdiction. And that tells us something important. In the ancient Near East, divinity was not an abstraction or philosophical exercise. It was embodied, located, and when necessary, carefully multiplied. So, what's significant about this ritual? Why does the Hittite plan to divide a god matter to us now? And there are a few takeaways that have stuck with me. First off, there's a level of theological sophistication here that we often don't consider or ascribe to ancient polytheistic beliefs. If we think about them at all, we may consider them as a rudimentary kind of placebo for the anxieties of confronting the precarious nature of life in a difficult world. And while there may be something to that, it doesn't mean the belief systems of ancient people were simplistic. When we step into the world, at least as best as we can, it may look and feel foreign, but it's not unreasonable or incoherent. How can a being be in 2 places at once? That's a real issue, one they recognized as a problem, but one that they had an answer for. A deity could divide their divine essence while preserving their personhood and animate multiple places at once, and this did not weaken the deity, but strengthened it. And that's a pretty sophisticated way of solving a problem that is completely outside of human experience. Secondly, I think there's a tendency to have a kind of cynical view on ancient beliefs. That these were maybe tools of control and manipulation of the more enlightened elites who surely didn't believe this nonsense, but found in religion a useful tool of control. And that perspective really does not hold up when we look at what ancient peoples wrote about their religious practices and beliefs. Honoring the gods and taking care of their needs was serious business. It was state business. And while we don't have to take the ancient beliefs about splitting God seriously ourselves, we have to take their belief in them seriously. And finally, when we do at least try to step into the world of ancient peoples, their world comes alive in a way that's far more enriching than if we just read history as a sequence of events. Stepping into their world and trying to see how they understood it may be difficult, but our appreciation of the past is richer when we remember to mind the gap.